Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern, and we will hear the presentation, City Planning to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Enhance Resilience. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box or in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and I'll do my best to answer those technical questions. You can also type in questions that you have for the panelists in your questions box as well, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And I will ask, if your question is for a particular panelist, please state so in your question. That just helps us as moderators get to the questions quicker and get them answered. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by the International Division of APA, and you'll hear a little bit more about them in the next few minutes here, but just wanted to shout out and say thanks for joining us this year and for hosting today's session. Today's session is worth 1.5 credits. I'm sorry, I don't know if the sustainability and resilience credit is good yet. I will let you know by the end of today's session. But you can log your credits at the end of the session today by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number. Both of those will be available on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And if you head over there, that's where you can register for all of our upcoming sessions. So be sure to head there to check things out. And if you are on social media, be sure you like us on Facebook. That's where I post important date or time changes. I also try to remind everyone about the week's webcast ahead. So be sure to like us so that you stay in the know. And we record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to head over there, search Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our well over 350 recorded sessions. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you get notified when we post new sessions. So again, if you have questions, type them in your questions box. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. We are recording the session. We post it on our YouTube channel. And by the end of the session, I'll be sure to let you all know if this session qualifies for our sustainability and resilience. I think it might, but I'll be sure to let you know by the end of today's session. So with that, I am going to turn it over to today's session moderator. Let me get this over, Tim Van Up. So Tim, you have just been made the presenter, so you can click to show your screen when you're ready, and then put it into hit from beginning, and you're good to go.
Okay, not working.
Did you hit from beginning? Up at the top there, the top left corner?
I'm not at my screen yet.
We see your slide deck.
Oh, you do see it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Why don't I see it? There it is.
There it is. Wonderful.
So this is just our landing screen. Thank you very much for the introduction, Christine. I'm Tim Van Epp, immediate past chair of the APA International Division. Been involved in the division for 8 years, FAICP, and I have a practice in New Jersey, international and statewide, relating to climate and sustainability. And I'm really excited for this presentation because we're working on a climate action plan in my community in New Jersey, and all my previous experiences is needed plus some to get to the desired endpoint. I'm continue to learn how to do this. So The International Division has a number of different initiatives and work groups, a recent one being this Climate and Sustainability Working Group. Jessica Schmidt is the leader. Bruce Stiftel, who's also on this panel, and myself formed this division, this working group about, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago. The objectives, we felt it was important to establish this working group because we thought from the international perspective, we need to foster discussion related to international dimensions of climate action, resilience, and sustainability within APA and abroad, to bring overseas innovations in resilience and climate action planning to American planners and communities, to better understand the US's achievement of the SDGs, especially related to planning, the SDGs being Sustainable Development Goals created by the UN Habitat. Increase US planner visibility in international SDG and climate processes, facilitate international division planners to help the world meet the SDGs and the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement target in global temperatures. So we're trying to accomplish this primarily, at least initially, through a series of webinars, and we're hoping to do that on a quarterly basis. We've already done one webinar. It was a session of World Town Planning Day back in November, and this is the second. The third and fourth, we hope, will be sessions at the National Planning Conference in San Diego in early May, and the World Urban Forum being put on by UN Habitat in Katowice, Poland, the Ukraine war allowing, and that would be in, I believe, very late June. So if you're interested in joining the working group, there's a contact information here. There'll be another one at the ending slide. And as Christine indicated, this is being recorded. So our two speakers, very interesting, although they're professors at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Always have trouble pronouncing that. They also bring a lot of practical experience, both in the state of California and towns or cities in California. Adrian Greve prepared award-winning climate action plans for Benicia and San Luis Obispo in California, worked on climate issues in Japan and sub-Saharan Africa, was lead developer of California's Climate Adaptation Planning Guide. Michael Boswell, AICP, is a member of UN Habitat's expert group on guiding principles for city climate action planning, senior advisor to California's multi-hazard mitigation plan, founded and directs California's annual Climate Action Planning Conference, and are co-chairs of the Climate Change Task Force of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. So, what the specific background rationale for this webinar is that city planners are at the center of local decisions that drive carbon emissions and are impacted by climate change. Strategies available to local planners. This will provide strategies available to local planners to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build communities which can adapt to sea level rise, increased urban heat, and other climate impacts. How urban planners are implementing locally appropriate solutions for land use, transportation, hazard mitigation, economic development, and municipal finance. and how planners can best work with elected officials and other stakeholders to build support for climate-based decisions. So with that, I introduce Michael Boswell to begin the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you to the International Division for hosting us this morning. Hopefully my screen is showing.
Everything looks good.
All right, great. Yes, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to do two-part presentation. I'm going to start with some kind of basic introductory information, cover some basic process, and look at some issues mostly related to emissions reduction. Then I'll turn it over to Dr. Adrian Greve to really dig into the adaptation side of planning. Okay. Adrian wanted me to start off with this quote. This is from the latest IPCC report. And you can basically see here the stark warning. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So the IPCC, I think, is being very clear and direct here that not only is the time for action now, that we are in fact behind where we need to be, and we have to act quickly. So hopefully the things we've talked today will help us to rise to this challenge set for us by the IPCC. I just wanted to mention our book. Adrian and I, along with a practitioner, Tammy Seal, who's a consultant with PlaceWorks here in California. This is the second edition of our book. It's intended to be a very practical guide for helping communities and those of you who might be, like Tim, working on climate action plan for your community, to really understand how to move through the planning process and create low carbon resilient communities. So much of what Adrian and I will be talking about today is drawn from our book. Let me just start with a few basics. I know with a large audience like this, some of you are perhaps old hands at climate planning, and some of you are just getting into it. So I'll start with just a few basics, and then we'll get into a little more detail. The basic question of what is local climate action planning? It's really a form of strategic planning, focusing narrowly on the issue of climate change, and really aimed at simply doing two things, though not simply. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the community and increasing the community's resilience to the impacts of climate change. And just a bit of, we think about this, our shorthand way of thinking about this is that we think that doing climate action planning is for most part simply doing good planning. It's doing the kinds of things that we've been talking about for a long time in planning that constitutes good planning. And ultimately, we're trying to protect against hazards, achieve energy security, sustainably develop our economies, and develop and ensure high quality of life, right? And these are things that as planners we've been working on for a long time, but there's a new urgency and a new reason to act around climate change. Why is local action needed? And I want to put this in the context of kind of the work we're doing. Of course, there's always some figures like this. Cities consume most of the world's energy and emit most of the world's greenhouse gases. So, you go where the problem is, I suppose. As I mentioned, we think that the things that we want to do to reduce emissions in a community can also improve the quality of life in these communities. And we know that many of the things that we need to do around land use, the built environment, transportation, these are largely managed and controlled at the local level. On the right, I have this sort of scales of action just to remind us of a couple of things. One is that we do need action at all scales. We as individuals, there are things that we all need to do as individuals. to reduce our emissions and make ourselves more resilient. Obviously, there's a role for international agencies, national governments, state governments, but the work that Adrian and I have done is largely focused on how to work with local government, cities, counties, unincorporated communities, that sort of thing. I'm going to walk through, in our book, we detail a lot of steps for how to go about doing climate action planning in your community. I'll show you those steps, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. We don't have time. I'm going to kind of try to hone in on some key points that we think are important or critical in this process of doing climate action planning. We describe this notion of phase one, kind of getting started or your preliminary activities phase. We talk about things like getting a community commitment, building partnerships, establishing your planning goals, putting your planning team together in your community, working out the logistics of the process, establishing a public education and outreach program, and auditing your existing community's policies and programs. In other words, sort of what are you already doing that is helping to reduce emissions and make your community more resilient? I've got, throughout the presentation, I have a few examples I'll show to illustrate some of these points. This first one I want to mention, I'm going to start right here in my very own community of San Luis Obispo. This notion of making a community commitment. In our case, this community commitment was really led by our city council and our mayor to not only do climate planning, but really to try to push our ambition in what we wanted to do. So we had originally adopted our climate action plan in 2012. We've since updated that. And in our most recent update in 2019, the city adopted a goal of being carbon neutral by 2035. So we've got 13 years in SLO to achieve carbon neutrality. This was elevated to what's called a major city goal, which means there's budget behind it. Also allowed us to create a full-time sustainability coordinator position, reporting directly to the city manager. And we built a community-based partnership. We basically began working with a grassroots group, but we formalized their role. And they're not simply an advisory body. They really are a community group that's working throughout the community to assist the city in achieving its carbon neutrality goals. So they're a very active group. So, you know, this was a buy-in from at all levels of government in the city, and really a buy-in from the community as well. And we think that's a key to making things work. Another one I want to mention is the city of Atlanta. I haven't checked in on the city of Atlanta yet, and there's been a lot of stops and starts with their planning. But I did want to mention them because in particular, when they went through their Resilient Atlanta work in 2016, the effort to engage the public and to really inform and educate and bring the public into the process was simply incredible. You can see here just some of the stats. They had 40 public events. They hosted these neighborhood planning unit meetings. They did over 100 interviews. They had a whole bunch of advisory groups, 100 different members from all over different sectors of the community on their advisory groups, and they really looked at leveraging existing plans. So again, here really establishing an outreach program to really bring the community along in this planning process. I mean, we know public participation is a good thing in general, and with this issue in particular, giving the needed education around it, giving the politics of it, I think it's even more important that we make sure the public is coming along with us as we do this climate work. Phase two of our planning process that we discuss has a number of steps. This is sort of getting more now into the technical and policy work after we've done that preliminary activities. So we talk in this section of the book about the baseline emissions inventory and developing a forecast, conducting a vulnerability assessment. Adrian will talk more about that in a moment. formulating your vision and goals, and then ultimately developing your climate action strategies. I just want to mention a few, again, some kind of technical and terminology things to make sure I'm bringing everybody along. We see as one of the, the first steps here is this really data, getting your data together. Again, Adrian will talk about the vulnerability assessment, looking at the impacts of climate change, but here I'm talking about the notion of doing an emissions inventory. And I'm showing an example from Placer County here in California. This was done by our co-author Tammy Seal and her firm Placeworks. But essentially what they're doing is looking at what's going on in these communities and quantifying the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that's produced on an annual basis. Here in this graphic, we're just simply showing both a 2005 inventory and a 2015 inventory, and Placer County was quite proud that they had been successful in a number of areas in terms of reducing their emissions through some of the activities that they were already engaging in. But this kind of emissions inventory really allows the community to understand where to focus their activities in energy. So for example, here in Placer County, semi-rural county, you can see that transportation emissions are the highest category of emissions. And so, this helped Placer County understand that a lot of their work needed to be on the transportation side of the ledger. So in addition to getting this data and putting this data together so that you understand your problem, as I mentioned earlier with the San Luis Obispo example, you have to set a reduction target. This is really something the community has to decide for itself, although increasingly we are seeing communities begin to establish carbon neutral targets for some out year. In fact, there's now something called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, an alliance of global cities that have made commitments to carbon neutrality. So I'm just showing here just some examples of some of those targets for carbon neutrality. It's still mostly common to set a percentage reduction target of your emissions. So say reducing your emissions 20 or 30 or 40% by some certain future date. And this will vary. I meant to mention earlier, so let me just take a quick aside and mention that it's often hard to talk about doing climate planning to a broad audience in a generic sense, because so much of this will be driven by local context. The kinds of things that we need to do here in our college town of San Luis Obispo, and I've done a little comparative work, are quite different from a place like Lawrence, Kansas, another university town, but with a very different emissions profile. So kind of the things and different impacts profile. So this is important to keep in mind that there isn't a one size fits all here. You really have to think about the local context. And that's why it's great to have the data, because you understand what is your emissions profile, what impacts are you going to have from climate change, and then you could customize your local policy. Sorry, this is just a little aside there I meant to mention earlier. When we get into talking then about the policy and emissions reduction, these are some standard buckets into which we put policy: land use, transportation, clean fuels, energy efficiency, renewable energy, ag and forestry, particularly if you're a more rural area or a county, for example, water and wastewater and solid waste. All these sectors have emissions implications. And again, though, they're going to vary from one community to the next, but these will ultimately be the kind of areas you're developing policy for reducing those emissions. Just a few tips to keep in mind, or a few ideas to keep in mind as you're going into strategy development. As I mentioned, you're going to respond to the data, your emissions inventory, and your vulnerability assessment. You're going to identify what is within your capacity in the local government to, or in your community to control and influence, which won't be everything. I mentioned fuels earlier, but typically communities have little influence over that issue. So you have to identify what do you have influence over. For example, some communities have their own utilities, right? So obviously they can directly impact how electricity is produced, but most communities do not have local utilities, and so they cannot influence that, at least directly. Integrating your local conditions, community values, being measurable and trackable in what you're doing. Adrian and I have reviewed hundreds of climate action plans from across the country, and one concern we see with many of them is the policies are too vague in general, and so it's hard to track whether you're making process. Thinking about who really is going to be the lead or the owner of the implementation of the plan. Is it going to be a city or city department, or are you developing a broader partnership in the community that can help lead the effort? Looking at other community goals, making sure that your work in climate planning is also helping you achieve other community goals. If you have a big community goal in public health, for example, making sure that your climate plan not only aligns with your public health goals, but in fact helps support and achieve your community health goals. And then I'll say more about this in a minute, but leveraging public and private partnerships. I got a few examples here. An international one, since we're presenting for the international division. One of the most aggressive targets in the country is the city, or in the world, is the city of Copenhagen in Denmark. They have a carbon neutral goal by 2025, so they've got 3 years to go. I haven't checked in lately to see how it's going. They're targeting in a number of areas, but what I really wanted to mention here in terms of developing, evaluating strategies is Copenhagen in their 2025 climate plan really did a fairly sophisticated analysis of the economic impact of moving towards climate neutrality. They were able to show a positive return on their investments, particularly those that were in energy conservation and efficiency. So they were basically showing that the money they were going to put into implementing this plan was actually going to return benefits to them. And they showed the potential for creating jobs through the implementation of their climate plan and moving toward the carbon neutral target as well. So it's just a great example of, you always think this as environmental work, but you can really see in Copenhagen, they see this as an economic development strategy, as well as something simply good to do for the environment. So thinking of evaluating your actions through that kind of lens as well. Also wanted to mention another aspect of working towards implementation with community partners, and that's the city of Evanston, Illinois. They also have a carbon neutral target a little farther out in 2050. But one of the really interesting things that Evanston has done in building their community partnerships is they've actually gotten commitments from major community organizations. And these are hard commitments in terms of actual emissions reductions that these major organizations in their community will achieve, and they're able to put that into their own calculations. So they've gone out there, built these partnerships, gotten formal commitments from these organizations to reduce their emissions by a certain amount, and then they can account for that and develop strategies that build around what these organizations are doing. This last stage is implementation and monitoring. This is where the rubber hits the road. All this great stuff that you've decided you're going to do in your community, you've got to actually go out there and do it. You have to monitor and evaluate it, and of course you have to update it as you move forward with implementation. Here I've got a lot of ideas here, and so I'm going to try to touch on these quickly, and I'll give you a couple of little bit more detailed examples in a moment. But this is some work that Adrian and I have been especially doing over the years. We're still doing some of this work, which was we went out, like I said, we've read a lot of climate action plans. We've interviewed a lot of climate action planners from around the country. And what we've been trying to do is focus in on those communities that have really had a lot of success. Not only did they create a plan, but they've reduced their emissions, it's going well, and try to identify what were the commonalities in these communities. What were they all doing that was contributing to their successful implementation? So we see these as important keys. And we put them in these three buckets: administration, engagement, and leadership. Under administration, the successful communities we have seen have really empowered their staff to move forward on implementing these activities, and often have developed specialized staff positions within City Hall, often reporting to a mayor or city manager, so they're empowered really to work across the organization. You know, the communities that, you know, if you're just sort of handing it off to a city staffer that's already got, you know, 30 other responsibilities, it's probably not going to be implemented very well. So, you know, that dedication of staff, organizing an implementation team within the municipal agency, getting everybody on board. That includes the fire chief and the police chief, as well as your usual suspects, you know, the transportation director and the planning director and that sort of thing. But building that implementation team, and we've seen many successful communities even build their municipal implementation team by bringing in some of these outside partners onto that implementation team. And then, no surprise, it was the number one constraint we found in a survey we did a number of years ago on implementing the climate plan was allocating funding. So obviously this is a you know, an eternal issue within local government, is where is the funding going to come from? But again, if you see this as an important issue in your community, you must identify funding to support the effort. And if you're, I suppose, clever like Copenhagen, it's going to return financial benefits to you as well. So it's a smart investment. On engagement, I've mentioned cultivating partnerships, engaging the public. I also want to mention this other idea of climate champions. In almost every community that we found that have been successful, there was some sort of identifiable climate champion, somebody who really could sort of command, had a command of the issues, could really speak to the issues, and could really build partnerships and bring everyone along. Sometimes this was a mayor, sometimes it was a city council, members, sometimes it was a community activist or a community based organization that had a lot of clout and respect in the community. But, you know, somebody really was out there kind of every day talking about the issue and trying to lead the community forward. And then under leadership, this last one, all the successful communities were leading by example. You know, the classic idea, they were putting solar panels on City Hall and converting their fleet to clean fuel or electric vehicles in the municipal fleet. But we all saw them leading by example, which communicated out to partners in the community that they were serious about this issue. And then finally is communicating the idea of co-benefits. And co-benefits is simply the idea that many of these things that we want to do to address climate change are good for the community, even if climate change wasn't a thing, right? So expanding transit and improving bike infrastructure has lots of other community benefits. It reduces congestion, it enhances public health. So these are good things to do, even if we weren't concerned about climate change. But they're good for climate change too. So they really do benefit the community in many ways. That allows us to speak to a number of audiences. A couple of examples here. Another example in community engagement is the city of Cleveland and the Cleveland Climate Action Plan. This example is about their Climate Action Fund. I don't know the latest on how this fund was going. I know it had some very good initial success. But this was a partnership. They built this fund through partnership, and they're using this fund to invest in projects in the community to enhance resilience and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. So here, really building through philanthropic organizations to help target specific kinds of efforts and projects. And the city of San Mateo, really is a great example of getting your city, your municipal organization organized to address climate change, dedicated staff, putting together a sustainability commission, really championing in the region. The community is also, City of San Mateo has been a leader in their region, getting other cities in the county to move more aggressively forward on climate change. They're definitely leading by example and do a lot of reporting out on their successes. They really celebrate their successes, produce an annual report, that sort of thing. let's see, the last thing I wanted to mention is some work that I did with UN Habitat, and I really just want to sort of point you at this resource. I don't have a link because usually the link is very ugly, but if you simply were to, in your search engine, put in guiding principles for city climate action planning, this is not a how-to guide. It doesn't tell you how to do climate planning. Instead, what we produced with the UN was a set of principles that describe how your planning process and your plan should be. And we go into more detail in there, obviously, but we talk about a plan that's ambitious, that's inclusive of everyone and all interests in the community, that's fair, that's comprehensive and integrated, that's relevant to the specific community you're working in, it's actionable, it's evidence-based, and it's transparent and verifiable. So I encourage you to take a look at this to help set some principles for how you go forward with your planning process. And the idea is it's universally applicable across all communities. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to, let's see, actually, I'm going to run Adrian's PowerPoint. So give me a second while I switch to the other PowerPoint. Okay. All right, Adrian, can you see your PowerPoint up?
Probably help if I unmute myself. Thank you.
Can you see your PowerPoint up?
I can see my PowerPoint. Thank you. We're
Perfect.
moving to
All right,
adaptation.
just let me know when to advance the slide.
Absolutely. Moving to adaptation, which is both more diverse, but in many locations, and increasingly so more visually obvious. This is Norfolk, Virginia, with sea level rise. And you can see similar photos from Boston, from San Francisco. There's lots of cities all over the world that are having today king tides, meaning wintertime, full moon. You have higher tides. It's a preview to what sea level rise is going to do, which is the most certain in terms of the width of the error bars in the projected climate impacts. You can change it, Mike. Next slide. Thank you. And really, I just want to highlight, this is the other half. It's a complementary and necessary half. No matter how good a job we do at greenhouse gas reduction, we still need to plan for adaptation. That's, as I said, increasingly obvious because it's being experienced in different ways everywhere. But even if we went carbon neutral as a planet today, we're going to be feeling climate impacts for a good long time yet. Next slide. When we think about climate change, it's really important to think about the impacts that are projected. And it's two big buckets. What we most often see headlines are the big acute episodic events, exacerbated hazards. And you often will hear climate change makes hazards more severe, more frequent, and in new locations. That's the flooding. I'm on the West Coast, so I am very familiar with wildfire. And what you see to the right is a set of data. This is from the 2014 IPCC report, but you see versions of this in nearly all of them since 2001, is that you can map average temperature increase. What's much more difficult to explain in a public setting, I have found, is increasing variance, which simply makes the space under the curve bigger, and this is a curve of frequency of event. If you combine increased variance with temperature, you see that you still have the same number of cold events, but the number of high heat events is almost more than double, and with higher temperatures. So you still will get intense snowstorms. So you can think of some of the polar vortex events that we've seen in the Northeast, but you're also going to have increased events of extreme heat. Think of the extreme heat events in the Pacific Northwest last year, where you saw Interstate 5 crack in Seattle or intersections in Portland. The other set of impacts are slower, but no less potentially damaging. And these are things like fall and spring, the timing of those. So spring starting sooner, fall lasting longer, the average length of winter shrinking. This is changing habitat ranges. This is different viability for crops, different spreads for disease vectors. For example, dengue fever in Florida, it hasn't been there for a long time and now it's back. That's mostly due to climate change. So it's really important to realize that there's both, and you need to handle both when you start thinking about climate change. Next slide. It's really important to think about the fact that in adaptation, it's progressive. So a little different, like greenhouse gas emissions, we want it to be slowly getting better. With adaptation, you have to assume things are getting worse. What we have control over is how quickly. But meaning your actions have a sell-by date, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They interact and overlap. What made lots of headlines is the Santa Barbara Montecito area had a huge fire. Shortly thereafter, intense rainstorms, also made slightly worse because of climate change, so climate exacerbated events. That resulted in landslides. So you end up having interacting and overlapping impacts, and they're site specific. The images that you see to the right, that's fires in Redding, that's heat in Phoenix, crop failure in the Midwest, sunny day flooding in Miami. Climate change looks different everywhere, so the policy and plans adopted to address it have to be contextual and site specific. Next slide. All right, getting really simple, just talking about climate change, there are only five direct climate impacts. Changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, and it's not universal. Average global temperatures going up. Precipitation changes. You may not have a change in total precipitation, but the timing and intensity and distribution through the year will change. Sea level rise, winds and storms, and ocean acidification. You see less policy around ocean acidification. The Seattle area, the Puget Sound, actually has plans around ocean acidification. Urban runoff exacerbates that, which affects the oyster farms in the Puget Sound. And so you start to see very specific adaptation actions depending on location. Next slide. If those are only five direct, we could spend the next half hour just talking about indirect. There are many and they're varied, and you can go a couple links down causal chains. These are five very common ones. Wildfire. Mike and I are on the West Coast. We experience this annually. Erosion, anywhere you can go. Ecosystem change and habitat migration. Pest and disease outbreaks. Extreme heat. But you can then find subsequent consequences. As I've said, they're different everywhere. Next slide. All right. Really quickly, the next few slides is going to be talking a little bit about adaptation strategies. So where do they live? How do they relate to greenhouse gas emissions? What are some organizing principles, and what are some about developing strategies, and then some organization ideas. Next slide. And there's some graphics here. Mike and I both served on the author team for the update to the California Adaptation Planning Guide. So some of, whenever you see Cal Office of Emergency Services as the reference, this is 1 year after the update to our book. So this is, you'll see graphics from there, but same idea. In terms of adaptation, more than greenhouse gases end up being held in very different places. Several years ago, I had a graduate team call every regional planning organization in the state of California. This is in 2010, so 12 years ago, asking, what are you doing for climate change? And some of them said nothing. And yet when we asked, said, okay, do you have change maintenance schedules for your roads? Oh yeah, we updated that last year. They seem to be wearing out faster. This is an adaptation strategy for heat. Have you updated your water management plan? Oh yeah. Do you have heat plans? We just have 2 new cooling centers this year. Is that we found they had adaptation. It was pragmatic planning. And so you can find that there are many places that do adaptation. It just lives in different places. And this is organized comprehensive focused plans and implementation programs. So you'll see it in general plans. Yes, in climate/adaptation plans, but also increasingly in local hazard plans, so LHMPs. It can then be implemented or stand alone in any range of the more focused plans, from active transportation to stormwater, as well as implementation. Ideally, you'd have all 3 in tiers, you'd have the overarching and then be implementing with some of the others. But different cities have taken different approaches, partly due to when's the plan being updated. If you have one of the more focused or more specific plans being updated, why not do it there? And then when you are updating your comprehensive plans, you can actually then integrate it there. Is that it often becomes a pragmatic, what can we do now based on update schedules. Next slide. This is really meant as a reminder. Very often we can treat adaptation and greenhouse gas reduction as 2 different buckets. They sometimes share. There's lots of things that share both, like urban heat island reduction. That often means trees. That sequesters carbon. It also cools. A lot of stormwater management do the same. It sequesters, it increases green space. It also cools, and it reduces flooding risk, at least site-specific flooding risk. There's a whole set. And the other thing to keep in mind is there's often an imperative or time difference. So if you take heat, a community may need something to address heat now. That may mean creating a cooling center. Depending on the fuel mix that feeds that community's energy system, it may not be greenhouse gas free, but you may need your cooling center now. You can set up a cooling center and then in the next 5 to 10 years have plans to move, either put solar panels on the top of the facility or move the whole community towards a greener fuel source. So fewer greenhouse gas emissions, so they're not necessarily in conflict, but the timing and imperative of the action may differ. And then you can simply look at what's the community need and phase them appropriately. Next slide. This is more similar to what Mike showed. You will need to create buckets. These are the state of California's sectors or kind of policy buckets. The state has a set of adaptation sectors. Like them or not, we all use them because as a state, you need to kind of have one thing so we can compare across the state. All the agencies, cities tend to adopt these as well. But wherever you are, you do need to organize into sectors. It's just easier organizationally, but this is a reminder. And these are some of the themes that show up and should show up when you're doing adaptation. And so some of them seem really obvious: water, oceans and coasts if you're a coastal city, agriculture if that's part of your sector, but you also have emergency management, public health. Nearly everywhere needs to have both of those as well. But you should make your sectors to honor where it is you're located. I've worked in a community where it was 70+% industrial. We had an industrial sector because you need to develop policy because so much of the employment base and economic base of that community was industrial. Next slide. You can read, and Mike and I have talked about this, no matter where you look at adaptation development, broadly speaking, all the guidance says the same thing. These are the 4 phases from the Adaptation Planning Guide in California. Explore, define, and initiate. Decide what you're going to do. What's the geographic scope? assess vulnerability, which is a key part. And it actually ends up being a really critical piece to setting scope and defining priorities for it. And then in a very traditional planning style, define your strategies, implement, monitor, and then adjust and go back to the beginning. So, next slide. All right. For setting scope, part of it, because adaptation is often can be fairly unwieldy, it touches more sectors, I would argue, than greenhouse gases in some ways, but it's more immediately experienced by community members in kind of a really obvious way that you can talk to them about is have a clear reason for why you're pursuing it. And one key thing is defining what does success look like. How are you defining resilience? Because different than hazards, a lot of times going back to what was before the acute climate influenced disaster occurred, you may not be able to go to what you were before. That's not your definition of success. So you need to clearly define what does success look like? And then think about, well, what do we need as a city to undertake planning for adaptation? Okay, assemble a team similar to what Mike talked about. Identify what you need to do that. And then as the last step before heading into vulnerability, and we will talk more about all of these, identify what you can already see as climate impacts in your community. And then identify who and what are the populations and community assets that are impacted. Next slide. All right, the biggest piece kind of the process is going to be assessing vulnerability. I'm going to move on real quick here. It's really, these steps tend to be more or less universal, regardless of which guidance you look at. Exposure, what do all the climate models downscaled for your region or global? What does the science say is going to happen where you are? So what are the hazards? How different are they from what's happened in the past? What's expected to change and where? Then you have sensitivities. What's going to happen? Are you ready for it? Which is, you're going to have the impacts. Who and what will be affected? How ready are you is adaptive capacity. And then you can score and prioritize each of those needs. So next slide. Exposure, and you can see in the image is Boston with sea level rise. The key part of this is not just what's going to happen, but to specifically ask questions. How different will it be from today? So look at today, 2050, 2100. How quickly? That's why you get those different time intervals. Is this something that's going to take 80 years to occur, or is this something that's going to be really problematic in the next 10? And then where? A lot of climate change impacts are really location specific. And can you, there's an animation on this one, Mike. Can you advance once? We're going to go a little bit international. This is 1,000-year floodplains in Kampala, Uganda. It's the capital of Uganda. And it's a good transition. They already flood in Kampala. I've spent time there in several occasions. Like easily once a month, heavy rainstorms cause major arterials. Over 30% of the lands within city limits are wetlands. So these are expansive, huge floodplains. Their rainfall distribution, their totals are not supposed to change. Their rainfall intensity and timing is supposed to change. So they will have much heavier rainfall in intensive periods and perhaps more extended droughts. The next step in vulnerability is to look at these wetlands. And so you can go to the next slide, Mike. In Kampala, those wetlands have fairly heavily populated squatter communities, or slums, if you will. That's important because that's part of the population, part of where does it matter and does it matter in this location, is to then break down which city functions are going to be affected. And it might be emergency services or police, or it could be some pieces of your economic system. You're also asking about structures, not just buildings, homes, businesses, but also all of your infrastructure. So roadways, cell towers. If a bad hazard happens, are you going to be able to have cell access? Are you going to have all of the means of communicating? And then populations, and these aren't just, yes, children, young, old, including any populations that may be vulnerable. And that also varies place to place. This might be those that are overburdened by rent or mortgage payments, more than 30% or more than 50% of their incomes. Linguistically isolated due to medical conditions or where they work and how they work. So in heat, construction workers, farm workers, any worker that's outside may be more sensitive than others. So you need to identify who's affected by the hazards or the climate impacts to which your city is exposed. Next slide. Once you know what's going to happen, who's going to be affected, you need to assess how much does it matter. And I have to say, I have on the right kind of my favorite slide for it's going to matter a lot. This is the Bay Area, so San Francisco, but there's 3 airports that are slated to be underwater with sea level rise: San Francisco International, Oakland, and then the military airstrip to the south there. Is asking the question, how long is it going to last? Is this just the runways will be underwater at high tide, or are they going to be inundated multiple days a week or multiple hours a day, every day? What's the extent of the impact? Size of the area? How many people? So if it's heat, how long is that heat going to last? Does it cool off in the evening? Does it not? And you can get general tendencies. What level of disruption? And the easiest way to think about that is, say, a coastal road. Is it going to be underwater and then the water's going to go away and it'll be dry and you can drive on it again? Or is it going to be washed out? Say if you have riverine flooding that may go over a road, or will it wash it out? That ends up being a really important disruption. When you think about disruption in San Francisco or Boston, Logan Airport was slated to be underwater. Think about the impact to a large city to have their international airport be out of commission in terms of trade routes and travel. Next slide. And the last one is, in some cases, these impacts, you're ready, and then it doesn't demand a huge amount of policy development, but you need to check. Say, are there things in progress to address it? Because in many cases, adaptation is simply pragmatic planning because the impacts are already happening. And so for a city to say, all right, what's in progress, what's planned, what can be easily implemented, how long and how much will it take to do that implementation? To what extent can those programs be strengthened? And then you also have to ask yourself, is it enough? For how long is it going to be good enough? And so it ends up being a pretty important piece to running through that, is asking yourself, how ready is it? We're in California. Southern California is going to have more fires, but you know what? They're generally ready because they already do. Where it looks really scary is in Northern California. I'm originally from Seattle. The whole rainforest burned 2 years ago. They're not ready. They don't have wide enough roads or ingress and egress for evacuation. There aren't zoning codes and building codes specifically for fire. How long will it take for Northern California, parts of Washington state, to be ready for the wildfires that are coming? This is part of what adaptive capacity is looking for. Next slide. And you don't have to, and I put this up purely to say you don't have to have full quantitative. You can actually prioritize your needs and a purely qualitative. You can get city staff, you generally know how hard will it be to do this, and rank it, high, medium, or low. How ready are we? Will we be able to deal with that, high, medium, or low? And you can change the axes on these, and lots of cities and states, I think Alaska 10 years ago had like a 13 by 13 decision matrix in their hazard plan, looking at various climate. And some of these impacts were huge. Even 10, 15 years ago, permafrost melting meant highways were cracking. And so you could actually look at cost, disruption, and a whole host, but this is how a very easy and fairly quick qualitative way to start prioritizing. You can assign dollars and actually make it very detailed with more time and investment. But you do need to prioritize and say, okay, the things that are going to be super impactful in some way to the humans or the structures or the economy of your local community, and how ready are you? Those that are incredibly impactful that you're not ready for in terms of your adaptive capacity, that's going to be a high need. And so you need to prioritize those. Next slide. Couple things. We'll talk about strategies here in a second, and not just about how to do it. A couple things about these. Strategies should be flexible because adaptation is progressive. You want them to be cost effective. And part of making it cost effective is have it deal with multiple things. A lot of times adaptation is pragmatic planning. And I say that to say adaptation often can address community needs that people that don't care about climate change, but will say, you know what, my city needs to do this. A lot of times you can address those and take preparatory action for progressive climate change. Specific is a way to pare down the challenge of uncertainty. And then it's integrative. You don't have to just be heat or just be like, you can deal with housing problems, which many cities in the US have housing shortages. You should deal with that as you deal with greenhouse gas reduction, as you deal with heat resilience, as you deal with many. So integrate across. As a reminder, sell-by dates, your adaptation strategy will only work for so long because it's progressive. Try not to get locked in, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And you have to monitor, especially for adaptation, because if you know the strategy won't work forever, you need to keep track of when you need to change it or strengthen it. Next slide. This is just heat, and this is why I don't have in-depth stories. We'll look at some other more in-depth city-specific, but just for heat, you can see different cities and different locations in the US have all handled it slightly differently and contextually. So building standards in Chicago, New York, Scottsdale, Sacramento, Cleveland. A lot of cities have tree programs. They're different trees. They have to be kind of climatologically informed, but also informed in terms of location and who cares for them. Is it collaborative between community and the city? Because a lot of trees is a maintenance burden on the city, especially if you have to water them and prune them, which ends up being a really important piece if they're in the streetscape. Cooling access and public health. You will find different strategies in different locations. So I'm not going to go in depth on any of these, but it's simply to say, as you're doing these and as an issue emerges, go see what others are doing. It actually can be really informative. Next slide. There are a lot of other sectors. Stormwater, this is timing of storms. Chicago, Seattle, Ann Arbor, state of South Carolina, all have strategies. My hometown of Seattle, they've done an assessment in terms of where are all the pinch points if our storms get more intense that we need to update first. And so they've looked at, okay, in 20 years, the 100-year storm is going to look much like today's 500-year storm. What does that mean for our infrastructure? It ends up being really important that you start looking at specific pieces. Of course, California and Washington, It's almost an annual event to have protracted wildfire seasons. You can go find cities all over both states that are adjusting building codes, managing forests. These are often integrated into their hazard management plans. Carbon farming, you can see this in Illinois, and this is sequestering of carbon, but it also is really powerful for adapting to drought. Increased carbon content of soils increases the water holding capacity by orders of magnitude, and there's increasingly more data. Ecosystem impacts, and of course the ecosystem is very different in different parts of the country, but from Flagstaff to Massachusetts, Arizona to Massachusetts, you have really different ecosystems with different sets of impacts, but you need to design strategies in similar ways. But I would go investigate. This is land conservation, restoration, and various adaptive management strategies. Next slide. I haven't talked about equity and outreach. Mike covered that. This is the one equity and outreach. This is from the city of Portland, Oregon. And I have to say, because Portland has the longest running history of climate planning in the US by many, many measures, this is modeled, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with these questions. The city of Flagstaff's climate plan actually has the same questions and say, yeah, we got it from Portland. But they're really good and interesting to think through. Does the action generate burdens to frontline communities or disadvantaged? It's an important question to answer. Being able to answer it means you know who those communities are. Does it resolve historic disparities? Are they accessible? Does it empower communities in meaningful, culturally appropriate manner? These are all important. Every policy you should evaluate and ask yourself these questions. Does it align and support community priorities? Again, you can use adaptation to address other things your community needs. Climate shouldn't be separate. It should be part of normal city function in a lot of ways. And so when you think about workforce development and fostering long-term relationships, I wanted to put this here, is that you need to assess through every phase, not just once we got a diverse participation, but also say throughout policy development and implementation, have we considered all of the equity considerations inside adaptation? Next slide. Mike covered many of these, so I'm going to go pretty quick. It's critical, and as Mike said, we've read a lot of plans and interviewed a lot of planners to say, well, why did it work? And we found it works best if there's a department, there's someone doing oversight and management. There's actually humans, a person, a team, where it's their job to implement. What's the timeline? There's a phasing program, and it's funded, and there's monitoring and evaluation so you can see if it's working. And this is true for both greenhouse gases and adaptation. Next slide. I'm only going to talk about 3 here. Mike talked about empowering staff. This is designating a staff person as a separate job function. So this is the resilience officer through Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities. This is naming a sustainability coordinator or manager, as many cities have, but having a person to do it. The next one I want to talk about is allocate funding. You can see Brent, who's a former chief of planning for the city of Vancouver, British Columbia. Truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in vision, it's found in its budget, and I would agree. The most effective plans are those that are funded, either through portion of their general plan, through taxes or fees, an additional sales tax, an additional gas tax, activity fees, to be dedicated specifically to an adaptation fund. There are multiple ways to fund it, but to have dedicated, allocated funding. And the final one that's highlighted here is engage the public. It's a way to assure progress. I interviewed a city who didn't at the time have a climate plan, but they had some of the most successful implementation I'd ever seen. Asking the staff, how'd you do it? They said, well, if the economy gets bad, don't lay off staff. And the number 2 thing is never stop engaging the public. If an election happens and you have a different city council, if the public knows what you're doing, they'll demand it regardless of who's the mayor. And it stuck with me because this is the city that has had political changes and have had success in an ongoing manner. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to have 2 cases of specific ways cities can address this, and it'll be pretty quick. One is a pathways approach. Next slide. What's powerful about a pathways approach is that it phases what are we going to do about it, and it specifically and explicitly anticipates having to change what we're going to do. And because you plan, it means you end up having to keep your options open, and it brings the public along. And you say, okay, we're going to do X until this point or trigger, and the public knows. And then they know when that happens, we're going to change strategy. And so in a sense, some of the down the road strategies may be less palatable. Think inward migration off of coastlines. But if you're warned, that might happen, but it won't happen until X does. It ends up being really important for planning. So I think just as a public education and awareness perspective, pathways ends up being a really powerful tool. Next slide. One thing is it demands that a community defines what's acceptable risk, and then you devise strategies so that you can stay below your acceptable risk. Next slide. So I have one really small example. This is for rail stations in Los Angeles. During heat waves, specifically for elderly rail riders that would need to use the elevators, found that heat was actually really difficult to deal with. And so the stages are over on the right in the colors. It's install cooling equipment, add another elevator, convert all of the elevators to be heat resilient. Next slide is that the numbers are triggers. What the triggers are, were any of these: number of outages, the cost of providing bus bridges, meaning you drive people to the other side because you had to switch sides of the rail to get to a train, the costs, is that means you have to change. And if you can make transparent what you have to change, it ends up being really important. Next slide. And you can then cost it out in terms of how long will it last, and the like. And I think in the interest of time, Mike, I'm going to kind of end there. I was going to talk about pathways again, but I want to stop there. So if you could close up and we can talk a little bit. Jeff, I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm going to go be right back.
Christine, did you note any questions that we should address?
Did you get a chance to look in the questions box? It looks like someone was kind of organizing some questions.
Tim, I've been looking at the questions that have come in, and I could go ahead if that makes sense.
Okay.
So we have about 13 minutes left, and lots of issues raised. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Adrian, for wonderful presentations. I think one key question that came in from Douglas is, how do you measure greenhouse gas emissions? Now, I know you can't address that question fully, but I wonder if you can give us a peek at where people would go and how they can frame that, understanding that issue. How do you measure greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, the short answer in terms of a tool is to use ICLEI's ClearPath tool, which is what most cities in the U.S. are using. I'm not going to say it makes it easy, but it is a standardized format, and it's probably make it as easy as it can be to determine your community's emissions. The more general answer, of course, is we don't measure emissions directly, although there's some work to try to do that eventually. But we estimate emissions by looking at activities within the community. So, what are the vehicle miles traveled? How much are people driving in the community? How much electricity is consumed in the community, and how's that produced? How much natural gas is consumed in the community? What is the waste profile of the community, and how's the waste dealt with? Is it landfilled, incinerated, that sort of thing? How efficient are your homes, and what level of industry do you have in the community? So basically, by identifying these activities in your community, there are quantitative methods. There's both a global protocol for greenhouse gas emissions accounting and a US-based protocol. So there are these tools and protocols out there to allow you to gather this community-based data and then essentially do some math, tricky sometimes, to estimate emissions within the community. There's a whole science around this, and so we typically direct people to ICLEI, local governments for sustainability. They're a global nonprofit, and they have a US arm. You can get the protocols from them, and you can also get the ClearPath tool from them.
I will add one thing. I'm going to add one thing on that is ICLEI's updating the US community protocols right now. They should be out next year, so 2023 at some point. And they're within that, they have what's called the US Community Protocol Dash, which is a much faster using global data sets and US data sets that are more generally appropriate for cities that want to go fast and they don't have a huge amount of resources. And then they have more detailed sets as well, approaches within that. And that'll be out next year, is to keep track of that.
Okay, Bruce, I want to add something as well. I agree with what Michael and Adrian said. My community is a member of ICLEI, and we're starting to look at tools that they have. In addition, though, we have something called Sustainable Jersey, which is associated with one of our state's universities, and it's a sustainability rating system. And they have, I think, gone a step further, where they have worked closely with all the electric and gas utilities in the state and compiled databases by county and by town of emissions using these sort of standard conversion factors for different sectors. And so they're making it quite simple for us to come up with our greenhouse gas inventory without a lot of rigorous scientific work on our part.
So let me draw several questions together on the theme of priorities. Diane asks, shouldn't cities be moving ahead quickly on their plans applying to government actions before taking on much more slowly whole communities and their actions? So government versus the private sector, but then also Balakrishan asks whether in trading off achieving low carbon development, building resilience and adaptation, and ensuring continued economic development, can you give us some light about how to manage those trade-offs and how to make the choices of which are most important? And then a third question is about the daunting nature of all this and how much staff and money it takes to do this kind of work. If you're a small agency, if you have a small staff and not much budget, where do you put your priorities? So 3 questions about priorities.
Go for it, Mike. You can take a first cut at it. I have comments, but you can go for it.
Yeah, it's I mean, we talked about the importance of local context, and there's certainly, Adrian and I have worked with some very, very low resource communities where I mean, they can barely keep the lights on in the city and the sidewalks clear. So there's certainly some communities where I think this is going to be very difficult to do, and in our case, we've tried to help those communities through some university partnerships. But the question on priorities is there's a couple of very brief answers I'll give that obviously don't speak to the full complexity here. But one is that there are certainly some things that you can simply do now without having to mount some sort of major climate action planning initiative. I mean, we know certain things we need to do. We know that we need to make a more rapid shift to renewable energy. And if that's something that can be done in your community, you don't need a greenhouse gas emissions inventory or a year-long planning process to tell you that. We know that we've got to get people walking, biking, using transit, switching to electric vehicles. We know we've got to get people doing that in our community. And of course, as I mentioned early on, that's something we've been talking about forever in planning. How do we get people to use alternative modes of transportation? So that's not a new issue for your community. But with that quote I put up at the very beginning, we do know that we need to go further and faster. So I think kind of my short version of the answer is a community that's highly constrained in its ability to do much new. What are you already doing, or what do you already know you need to do in your community to achieve other planning goals that aligns with what needs to be done in climate work, and put your effort there? So that's my short, simple answer. I think there's a lot more complexity behind this too.
The only thing I will add there is it's kind of the other end, is that Mike is right. A whole bunch of the things that help you with climate help your community regardless, and we've been trying to do for a really long time. I've been working with communities on integrating climate into their capital investment plans, meaning for large infrastructure, making it low carbon or carbon neutral, and adaptation, meaning resilient, not in floodplains, making sure it's built in a way that's resilient to heat and out of the way of flooding, and fires and landslides and the like. But when we do the assessment with these cities, every single time, in terms of operations and maintenance, longevity of the project, they save you money. And so you have not carbon or climate interested financial officers at these cities say, yeah, do the cheap one, which is often the carbon neutral resilient one. And we're finding, even in this, a small marginal increase in project construction yields life of project benefits, meaning you won't have to rebuild it. It'll be cheaper to operate, which I think it often becomes easier, is that you find as you get into it, and increasingly happening, renewable energy is cheaper per kilowatt now than almost any other type. So a lot of these end up making fiscal sense. And you're seeing a lot more external, like private funding, green bonds and things that give you lower rates on municipal bonds, if you have the data, ends up being a really important motivator and justification for cities to take some of these actions.
Thank you. So given the time, I think this will be the last question, and I'd encourage you to try and take just a moment to answer it, even though it's potentially a big question. And then we'll turn things over to Tim to conclude the webinar. Are there resources this is from Carlene, are there resources you would recommend to help cities identify creative solutions to structurally fund climate action plans in their budgets? Resources you would recommend for funding?
For funding, I would look at a few places. I'm sure Adrian has some suggestions. I would look at some of the work that the Rocky Mountain Institute has done, which I think they've rebranded. Now they're just RMI, but historically they were the Rocky Mountain Institute. I know they've done some work around this, and they've produced some different resource guides on actions communities can take, and some examples from around the country on how this was done. So I would take a look there. I think it's important to get networked on this work because it's being done all over the country. There's, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of good ideas out there. And so I'd recommend 2 ways to network. As Tim mentioned, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, considering joining or at least connecting with them. And the other is the U.S. Sustainability Directors Network, USDN, is a network of professionals who work in their communities on issues of sustainability and climate change. An incredible resource, incredible knowledge bank, and great way to connect with fellow professionals who are trying to address similar problems. It's the kind of place you can go and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this kind of municipal fee program to support a recycling program. Has anybody done that? And there'll be 5 people that have done it and can speak to how it went in their community. So I would just point people at those networks and those resources.
I would agree. Mike stole my #1 resource, which was USSDN. The Sustainability Directors Network is incredible. They also have funding programs where they assign other cities to end up following along the grant recipient to learn from implementation. So it ends up being a mentoring network. And if you talk to cities that are enrolled, they'll tell you, I feel like I'm an island, except for the week I go to the annual conference, I'm rejuvenated for the next year. Is that they finally find peers and they can talk about what worked, what doesn't work, and kind of lessons learned, and how did you pay for it? Did you try this new tax? Did you get this grant? Kinds of strategies and creative sources. And it ends up being a really good means of getting information, but also kind of means of partnership and mentorship. Can be really powerful. I will also say there's a ton of movement in global fiscal world that fund municipal bonds, which are seen as the most viable route for green bonds. If you look at major international financial institutions, they want cities to demonstrate that they're building green and they want to pay for it. And there's a whole bunch of entities that are getting after that. So things like Breckenridge, they're the largest issuer of green bonds in the US. But increasingly that's happening both internationally. There's an entire European green bond market. San Francisco is the #1 city in the US getting those bonds. But there's room for it and there's room for collaboration on it. And so Milken is trying to put together a coalition of mid-sized and smaller cities in the US to go after the infrastructure bill federally. And so you may see funding trickle down, both from some of the Biden administration's bills, as another source, if you can organize and kind of get yourself there. But there are institutions looking to help some of those cities.
Well, Adrian and Michael, thank you so much for this superb orientation to climate action planning that I think really sets an agenda for us in this webinar series. I think in the months that come, we're going to try and bring in examples of people doing the sorts of things you've been describing and share those with the practice community, not just in the US, but globally. And we have people on this webinar from all around the world. I want to thank them all for being here. Tim, let me turn it over to you for concluding remarks.
Well, I think you just said it all, Bruce. Stole my thunder. But yeah, terrific presentation. Very helpful to me personally and in our community climate action planning efforts. And I'm definitely going to order a copy of your book.
Thanks to everybody and the International Division for joining us today. Don't forget, we are recording the session. We'll have it posted on our YouTube channel by the end of today. And as promised, I'm letting you know that the CM credits are available. 1.5 AICP CM credits are available, and also 1 credit for the new required sustainability and resilience requirement. So that is also available to you. So with that, thanks everyone again for joining us, and everyone have a great week. We'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.